Hi, classmates. Recently, Dan Lee, our instructor, gave us some work questions, descriptive questions. So I answered those questions, and I have some presentation here to present. Strategic management insights. I tried to summarize the answers in this presentation. I'm going to show you a Word file of the questions and answers that I submitted. So on your left top, you will see the Word file, and on your right is the presentation. So you can have a look. So I have briefly wrote few agenda of the descriptive questions like common elements of a mission statement, types of strategies, alliances, three general orientation of directional strategy, major outsourcing errors to avoid, stages of international development, successful downsizing guidelines, limitations of profits as performance measures, and scorecard applications. So these are some of the presentations slides here, and then we move on to the questions. The first question was related to it's here number one. What are the common elements of a well-crafted mission statement? So answer is like purpose, values, audience, focus, clarity, inspiration, relevance, uniqueness, sustainability, and action oriented. So I have presented these, and I have defined each one of them. Then there comes question number two, discuss the three general orientations comprising directional strategy. So those are strategic alliances, joint ventures, equity alliances, non-equity alliances, horizontal alliances. So, and I gave some of the examples here of some of the automobile manufacturers sharing platforms for developing electric vehicles. Then vertical alliances, I gave example of a clothing brand partnership with textile manufacturers. Then the global alliances, I gave example of Starbucks collaborating with local firms in Asia for market entry. Then for the innovation alliances, I mentioned here partnerships and focused on research development and innovation, gave examples of pharmaceutical companies collaborating on vaccine development. Then co-branding alliances, I gave example of Apple and some other firm on fitness tracking devices. Then industry consortia, I gave example of the airline industry collaborating in global ticketing system. Then moving on to the question number three. So in question number three, there are some other issues that our teacher raised, and I tried to mention answers for those as well. So these are, as I discussed on the presentation, you can see the type of strategic alliances, joint venture, equity alliances, horizontal alliances, global alliances, and others. Then moving on to the next questions, we can see question number three is discuss the three general orientation comprising directional strategies. So I mentioned growth orientation, and then I defined it, I mentioned the approaches, concentration, diversification, and integration. Then the stability orientation, I mentioned the definition and approaches, and mentioned pause or proceed with the caution, no change strategy, profit strategy, and all. So then I defined one more, a retrenchment orientation, spoke about turnaround, divestment, and liquidation here. So that was our question number three. Then we can move on to the next questions. After this, but the teacher gave us more questions regarding outsourcing errors to avoid, so we can have a look on those as well. So the question number four is, what is outsourcing? What are the seven major outsourcing errors that should be avoided? So I mentioned about outsourcing, gave example of Google. I typically mention Google here. Google outsources technical support in all details. Then the seven major outsourcing errors to avoid with Google related examples: lack of clear objective, choosing the wrong partner, poor communication, and all that. Understanding hidden cost, failing to protect data security, over dependence on outsourcing, ignoring cultural and regional differences, avoidance by the Google. So I mentioned this here. We can move on to the next question that is here. Let me see the slide as well. Let me move the slide as well. So, as I mentioned here, stages of international development. This was somewhere in the questions. The question was, in a dynamic environment, using consensus to arrive at a strategic decision is not recommended. What two techniques can strategic managers use to avoid the consensus trap? So I mentioned here slow decision making, risk of compromise, groupthink, and the techniques to avoid the consensus trap, devil's advocacy, and dialectical inquiry. I mentioned here, and then we can move on to question number 6. And let me see if I have a slide for this as well. For the question number 6, I think it's regarding this is in business strategies. Discuss the 5 stages of international development by giving digit of revenue generation. So I tried to give 5 top of most Fortune 500 companies 5 stages of international development: domestic stage, then the international stage. I gave example of Walmart here for the domestic one, and for the international I mentioned Amazon here. For the multinational stage, I mentioned Apple here, defined and its characteristics as well. For the global stage, I mentioned Chevron here, that operates globally in oil exploration. Then transnational stage I mentioned, and then I gave example of ExxonMobil here. So you will see summary with revenue, illustration, and all details. This is in terms of the digits I tried to mention here. Probably the presentation, the answers and the presentation, they may not be synchronized because I created the presentation with my file. So the limitations of profit as performance measures. This is one of the questions here. So let's move on to the next question. And that is question number 7. What are the 4 stages of corporate development in terms of business strategies? So I mentioned top 3 companies of the world. So startup stage is here. I gave again example of Walmart. Growth stage, I gave example of Amazon and Apple. And for maturity stage, I gave example of Walmart, Amazon, and Apple, and compared them. For the renewal or decline stage, I mentioned again these 3 companies: Amazon, Apple, and Walmart. So next is the summary. Here you can see Walmart, Amazon, and Apple growth in terms of maturity and renewal, decline. Then let's move on to the next question. Next question was related to for the successful downsizing. So let me see if I have a presentation here for the successful downsizing. Um, so I have some of the slides here. This is, I think, in the last questions, balance scorecard application. We will discuss that later. So look at the Word file, list the guidelines proposed by successful downsizing. So I mentioned guidelines here. I focused on the Canadian companies here. So the one is the develop a clear strategic plan. I gave example of Air Canada here, and then the communicate transparently. I gave examples of Rogers Communications, and to focus on core business functions, I gave example of the Bombardier, because these are the companies we should discuss regarding downsizing. For the offer support to affect employees, I mentioned Shopify because our teacher mentioned this a lot. So I'll just read it. After announcing layoffs to adjust to post-pandemic e-commerce trends, Shopify offered generous severance packages and job placement assistance to help affected employees transition smoothly. So for the engaged remaining employees, I gave example of Thales. This is a good example here. Then to avoid overcutting, I gave example of Suncor Energy. Number 7 is evaluate and learn from the process. So I gave example of Hudson-based company HPC's example here. This is the summary of the guidelines with examples. With Air Canada, Rogers, Bombardier, Shopify, Thales, Suncor, and Hudson Bay. Let's move on to the next question that the teacher asked is what is the most commonly used measures of corporate performance in terms of profit? I mentioned here in terms of profit, discuss the limitations of using these measures. So I just mentioned in terms of revenue, and I added the most commonly used measures for corporate profits. Let me see where I am at the presentation thing. Yeah, this is the last. We will just go through each of the presentation. We can have a look here as well. So we started with these slides. Started with the strategic management insight, and these were the questions. I mean, the summary of the questions those were asked, and then we discussed about the common elements of a mission statement. I discussed that in my answer, and then the types of strategic alliances I mentioned that in my answers, and the 3 general orientations of directional strategy I mentioned in my answers. Then I mentioned major outsourcing errors to avoid in the descriptive answers, and stages of international development, domestic, international, multinational, global stages. Then in the answer, I mentioned with examples successful downsizing guidelines as well, and then in almost in the last few questions, limitations of profit as performance measure, because performance measure was asked, so I related this with the revenue and profit. So the balanced scorecard applications, financial perspective, I discussed customer perspective, internal process perspective, and the learning and growth perspective I discussed. So again, let's moving on to my word file. The ninth question is answered here. Revenue growth examples I gave again here, example of Air Canada, Shopify, and Suncor Energy. The limitations I discussed here, short-term focus ignores non-financial factors and vulnerability to manipulation. Then to like excludes economic value added EVA issues I discussed, gave example here. So again, Sears Canada, if you guys remember, it was a garments thing, Sears Canada, that I gave the summary compared with BlackBerry, Meta's, Nortel's network, high profit firms with high cost, and Sears Canada liquidity crisis. So the last question that was asked by our teacher is what is the balanced scorecard in examining key performance? So this is the slide here, balanced scorecard application. We can have a look at the presentation, financial perspective and customer perspective, internal process perspective, learning and growth perspective I discussed here. So this is the, you can see here again the definition is an explanation of financial on the word file, customer perspective, um, internal process perspective, and the learning and growth perspective. Then here I like to choose the Chinese companies. So I mentioned some of those like Alibaba Group. You can see the financial perspective, and 134 billion Alibaba generated, then the customers and internal this. And then I also, after that, I chose again a Chinese, Tencent, social media gaming company. This is Chinese. And BYD, electric vehicle and energy solutions. This is again a Chinese. It's you can see achieved revenues 58 billion into last year. So this here is a summary of the table with Alibaba, Tencent, and BYD, all Chinese companies. So then this is what I submitted to our honorable teacher, and we can discuss that in the class. So thanks for your time, and I hope next time I'm gonna prepare more information regarding the descriptive questions. Thank you.